Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. We are here for a live stream on the 20th of May at 22:31 in the evening, and we are back with another 5 days at least of live streams tonight, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and we've got a couple of other things, notable things coming up this week. We have the now regular weekly series on the debates in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks in the 1920s, and that'll be on Wednesday of this week at the usual time of 10:30. And we will have a special program in response to an inquiry from a listener, and will be on Thursday, and that'll be a critique of the Trotskyite theory of the permanent revolution, and a critique of myself and previous positions taken 3 years ago now on the original form of this program, which was a podcast, of course. So come back on Thursday to hear me critique my prior position on that one. Right, we are here today, though, to talk about principally two events, which is one, the death of President Raisi of Iran, who was killed yesterday on a flight on a helicopter back from a state visit to Azerbaijan, and was killed in the Iranian part of Azerbaijan. Of course, Azerbaijan, and indeed what's now Armenia, quite a bit of the Caucasus were historically in old Persia. That's a bit of a side issue, but worth noting. And now the point worth noting here is, of course, that it wasn't just President Raisi. It was Foreign Minister Abdullahian, the Raisi's security service officer, Mehdi Mousavi, representative of the supreme leader of Iran in eastern Azerbaijan. So that's Mohammed Ali al-Hasham, and the governor of the province, Malik Rahmati, all killed in the same helicopter crash. Now, the helicopter in question apparently was a 30-year-old plus model called the Bell 212, which of course is an old American make. And there's speculation apparently going on in Iran about, many different theories as to what happened. One of which, though, is mechanical failure. And it is, of course, eminently possible that this was something that was down to mechanical failure. Now, helicopters, even when the helicopter is completely up to date in the modern version of that particular aircraft, don't have the best safety record. They even in countries where, again, they're completely modernized versions, they tend to crash, not on a regular basis, but on a fairly semi-regular basis. I remember one prominent helicopter crash in this country a couple of years ago, where the billionaire owner of a football club, Leicester City in this case, died after there was a failure on takeoff of his own personal helicopter, and the whole thing crashed and blew up, killing the passengers instantly. So helicopters aren't the safest way to conduct passenger transport. You add into that it was flying through mountainous terrain in a thick fog, and you have a potential for disaster there. There are, of course, other explanations going around, and we must, of course, say that nothing at this stage can be ruled out. And this makes us turn to the other explanations being proffered at the moment, which are, of course, more in the direction of this was some kind of attack and assassination carried out either by Israel or the United States, or one of the numerous terrorist organizations of which the Israelis and the US can avail themselves of the services of at any particular moment. So these are things which can't be ruled out, given that the US and the Israelis have conducted many assassinations in Iran over, many decades now, and that they would try to take out the head of state and the foreign minister, again, can't be ruled out. The Israelis, as we will cover later, are in a particularly desperate jam. They can't win their war. They can't expand their war. They are under an increasing amount of pressure. The Iranians got the better of them in their exchange a few weeks ago. So would there be people in the Israeli state structure and the American state structure who would look at this and think, how can we find an opportunity to strike back? Could we take out the president himself? There would certainly be people in Israel and the US who would want to do that. I would point out, though, that it seems to me, to my untrained eye, I'm not an expert, of course, on helicopter travel or air safety or how to conduct assassinations, just in case anybody from MI5 or MI6 is watching. And Paul Mason, I know you are. But it seems to me that would be a tremendously difficult endeavor to carry out, particularly to penetrate the security of the office of the Iranian president, to find out what the flight path was, to either sabotage the helicopter or take it down via some missile. It doesn't seem to me to be the easiest job in the world. Then again, we can't rule it out. But it seems to me to be more likely to be a case of mechanical failure, given where it went down, given the age of the equipment involved, given that we know that the Iranians do have some very advanced weapon systems, such as air defense and drones and things like that. But their actual air force, the fleet of aircraft they have available to them, most of which these date back to the 70s or earlier. If you look at the Air Force aircraft that they have, a lot of it, most of it, in fact, stems from the planes that were sold to the Shah's regime back before 1979. And the Iranians have proven themselves adept at keeping these things in the air for far longer than you would have thought possible, given the number of sanctions they've been under. But, of course, wear and tear does get to play its part. And even though I say they have prioritized their very advanced developments on missile systems, what they've done is they've designed their defense to be very difficult for the Americans in particular to get through without suffering enormous casualties. But they haven't got offensive air capabilities because they haven't been able to modernize that aspect of their air force yet. They're only just starting to undergo the modernization of their air fleet, so to speak, with the contributions from the Russians. So they're just starting to get training jet aircraft from the Russians so that they can train a new generation of Iranian pilots on the Sukhoi aircraft. So their helicopter fleet is clearly out of date, and that could be a factor here. We won't know for a while exactly what it was that brought down the Iranian president's helicopter, killing him, the foreign minister, and several others. Now, let's assume, though, that some of the maniacs in Israel or the United States, or probably both, might have done this. Well, what would their expectation have been if indeed there was some kind of scheme to do this? Well, on a purely, shall we say, revenge-based level, there is that motivation from the Israelis. They were humiliated by the Iranians recently, revealed that their Iron Dome to be rather impotent and overwhelmed by fairly cheap Iranian drones. They revealed that they could hurt Israel quite badly. So there'll be many of those in the Israeli security services and military who might have wanted to do this out of an act of revenge. We know that there are many in the American security structure who would also be well up for doing that. There are also those in both countries who are, or particularly the United States, who are deluded and stupid enough to believe that if they took out the Iranian president, the entire Iranian state system could crumble. This is a complete delusion. If you study the way in which the Islamic Republic's constitution, even if you study this in the shallowest way possible, if you look at like the way they conduct their regular elections, they have clearly a line of succession in place behind each of their major offices of state. So there's a line of succession for the supreme leader, in this case, Ayatollah Khamenei. There's a line of succession which has been activated if the president dies. So he's handed over to the senior vice president, a guy called Mohammed Mokber, who's been around in the state structure of the Islamic Republic for almost as long as Raisi was. And Raisi's time involved in Iranian politics goes all the way back to the 1979 to 1980 revolutionary period. So they have lines of succession. They have a actual separation of powers outlined in their constitution. They have trained men who can take over when somebody in a senior office dies whilst in office or is assassinated. Remember, the Americans actually thought that by taking out Qasem Soleimani, they could damage the operations of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, damage the Iranian operation in Syria. This proved not to be the case. There were plenty of other capable IRGC officers who could take over that role. And so, but the way in which the idiots in Washington think, or some of them at least, is that if we just take out the big guy, then the whole thing crumbles. They've got the same obsession with Putin, some of these characters. They think that if they just take out one man, then the whole thing will fall apart. Now, in the case of Putin, maybe 15 to 20 years ago, that might have been more true, but I think much less true now. One of the things you do if you want to establish a system which is going to outlast you is you strengthen the institutions. You make sure there is a solid basis for the rule of either yourself or your particular group. You make sure that the institutions of the state can survive the taking out of any one individual. And the Iranian system clearly has that in place. There'll be presidential elections within 50 days, and somebody else will be elected to the office of president. So in terms of if the Americans had any desire to try and use this to disrupt the operations of the Iranian government, it will have some disruption, undoubtedly. But in terms of causing the whole thing to collapse somehow, as some of the more deluded fools in Washington seem to think that will happen, it simply won't. Now, the idea that this is going to somehow trigger a mass uprising in Iran in favor of whatever comprador shithead the Americans have in mind to place on the throne, again, that's not happening either. You have a number of people, large numbers of people in Iran who have all manner of grievances against the Islamic Republic and the way it is organized and its current leadership. But none of these people, very few of them, want to go in with whatever scheme the Americans have in place via the MEK, the restoration of the line of the Shah, or whatever other idea they've got this week. So it just simply doesn't have any support, whatever crazy idea the American imperialists have about using this to disrupt the political stability of the Iranian state. The Iranian state's political stability is very much secure, it seems to me. And so any crazed notion that they were going to be able to execute some sort of regime change operation by doing this, if indeed it turns out that either the US or the Israelis had some sort of role in this, is a complete non-starter. Again, based on estimates that I have seen, again, between a fifth and a quarter of the population in Iran will routinely turn out to support the system or are strong supporters of the system. The other 3/4 of the population might have all manner of mixed opinions, but if you can potentially mobilize that many to defend or to demonstrate in favor of the current system, then you are already way ahead in terms of your ability to keep the system stable. That you add to that the larger number of Iranians who might have all manner of grievances against the Islamic Republic, but aren't willing to sacrifice sovereignty and independence to redress or try to redress whatever grievance that they have, then again, whatever plan the US has, it just isn't going to work. Didn't work when they killed Soleimani, and the death of Raisi and the foreign minister and others isn't going to really derail things either. It's not going to change the fundamental trajectory of Iran, which is into being integrated further into the BRICS system and other institutions which are managed principally by the Russians and the Chinese. US policy towards Iran to try and sanction it to death isn't going to change. And so the trajectory now economically for Iran lies in building a more economically prosperous alliance with two rising economies, rather than trying to negotiate their way back into being able to do business with the imperialist bloc, which they did try for a number of years. They've all clearly reached the collective conclusion across the many different political factions that do exist in Iran. So, and I suspect that there would have been those who would have been desperate to find some sort of compromise with the imperialists, but the imperialists were never offering one. The conclusion and the consensus seems to be in the Iranian system that the BRICS way is the way to go, and that way lies greater prosperity, which is, in my view, unarguably true. So whatever anybody who might have tried to do to plan this, to execute it, if indeed it turns out not to be an accident, isn't going to get very far. Whatever they were planning that they wanted to would have wanted to achieve by potentially doing something like this is just simply not on the cards. It's all wishful thinking. It's all fantasies. And I would say that the further point I wanted to make here was that I threw out some 10 points to basically put off anybody who was too much of a stereotypical leftist from following my Twitter account. And I included on there the simple statement that Iran plays a progressive role in West Asia. And it just gives me the opportunity to elaborate on that a little bit more. Now, when I say progressive role in West Asia, what do I mean? I mean that the Islamic Republic of Iran, whatever its internal contradictions and antagonisms, and indeed those do exist, when it comes to the Palestinian liberation struggle, it undoubtedly plays a progressive role via its aid to multiple now different Palestinian national liberation groups, not just Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also PFLP, DFLP, the Marxist groups that operate as part of the National Liberation Front, should we say, in occupied Palestine. They have, of course, extended their sympathies to the Iranians today, and they, as Marxist organizations, recognize the progressive role that Iran has played in supporting the Palestinian resistance, as the Iranians play a progressive role in supporting the Lebanese resistance in the form of Hezbollah. Now, it's of course untrue and incorrect to allege, as the American imperialists and their numerous think tank geeks do, that Hezbollah is simply a cat's paw of Iran. That is not true. However, there are links between the two, and have been for a long time, and Hezbollah has proven to be a resolute and determined fighter for Lebanese sovereignty and independence. That struggle still goes on. And the principal contradiction facing Lebanon, of course, is imperialist domination via the US, the French, and their local proxy, which is, of course, Israel. And it is against that which Hezbollah has battled, with partial success in terms of evicting the Zionists from southern Lebanon. And, of course, in the sense that Iran assists that, again, Iran is playing a progressive role. Iran also played a progressive role, and continues to, in their assistance to the Syrian government, in their assistance to the Syrian government's fight against US imperialism, in this case in the form of US imperialism's foot soldiers, be it ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra or whatever rebrand they've gone through, the Free Syrian Army, the various different franchise operations, which are essentially Salafist American mercenaries, in effect. And again, by preserving the Syrian government led by President Assad, which has this is the best option in terms of preserving Syrian sovereignty and independence, again, you have to say that Iran plays a progressive role there. Same with the struggle in Yemen. The Ansar Allah, and they are leading a national liberation front, essentially, which contains many different aspects to it, political aspects. And they are the most resolute and determined fighters for Yemeni sovereignty and independence against US imperialism, British imperialism, and their Saudi proxy. And again, as much as the Iranians have assisted that struggle, that is, again, a progressive role to play. The 1979 revolution in Iran also did certain progressive things, such as kicking US imperialism out eventually of Iran, even though, of course, and this is where we get to the contradictions inside Iran, there are many elements in the leadership, and still there were back then and still are today, that are stridently anti-communist. There are many that are pro-capitalist. There are some who, of course, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sure would have happily have done a deal with US imperialism if US imperialism was prepared to do a deal with them. They never were. So again, this is the Islamic Revolution of 1979 produced a government and a system with a lot of contradictions to it, but which has played a progressive role in many different areas and plays an anti-imperialist role in West Asia. That, in my view, isn't even a controversial thing to say. These are all things which we can objectively prove by simply interrogating the situation in West Asia as to what are the primary contradictions facing Lebanon, facing the Palestinians, facing Syria, facing Yemen, facing Jordan. You know, the contradictions are imperialist domination via either local compradors or direct US military domination, or the domination imposed via the Zionist colonial state. And you, in my view, can't make much of an argument to say that the combating of those forces is progressive, and therefore, if the Iranian government is doing that, insofar as they do that, that is a progressive role they are playing. Now, if the PFLP and the DFLP in occupied Palestine can recognize that, then why can't we? We do, most of us will do, watching this channel tonight. But the amount of responses I got from that was screaming, theocracy, blah, 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 usual things. Now, I shouldn't mock these people who responded in that way too much, because 10 years ago, I held the same position. And it's because I hadn't properly educated myself as to the nature of imperialism. I hadn't properly educated myself as to how imperialism could be combated in West Asia. And I hadn't properly educated myself as to the sometimes contradictory and sometimes progressive nature of the Iranian government as it stands today, and the nature of the 1979 revolution. Now, it's permissible, of course, and we have to allow everybody to make mistakes, because certainly I've allowed myself to make a number. But if you're just coming up with things like saying theocracy about Iran without doing further research, then you claim to be some sort of Marxist, then you're not carrying out a proper scientific analysis. You're not using the tools of scientific socialism that Marx and Engels bequeathed to us, and which Lenin, Stalin, and Mao took on so much further. You're not using that effectively. And so I would urge everybody who had that knee-jerk response, if you're watching this video, to go back and interrogate the situation again. Particularly read Lenin, read Stalin, read Mao on how to identify the primary contradiction at any given moment. And if you do that, you will be able to clearly identify what the primary contradiction facing all of these areas in West Asia is, and therefore who's playing the progressive role if they're combating that primary contradiction and aiding the struggle towards sovereignty and independence in these countries. Right. Pausing now for greetings, questions, comments, etc. Good evening to Beiju, who joined us. Good evening to Davey. Good evening to Tim Gray. YepX, good evening to you. Richard, hello. Hello to Zuleika. And Luca has joined us. Roddy is with us. Sammy joins us from Lincolnshire. Hello to Almir. Abtin is with us. And as is Kevin from Sligo. Guy joins us from Brazil. Maro is joining us from Liverpool, just up the road. Hello to David in West Yorkshire. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Michael joins us from West Belfast. Roddy says, the same day that the Yanks say President Raisi has blood on his hands, they describe the ICC in seeking indictments of Netanyahu and Gallant as outrageous. Yes, well, we'll come to that in just a moment. Much more to say about that. David joins us from Londinium, as he puts it. Cobra Commander has joined us, and we got someone called SW Haster says, Real trouble is what comes next. Now there is a political vacuum created. All the nefarious forces funded by the US and its lackeys are going to cook something up, I'm sure. Well, they'd love to answer your point, but as I said, the Iranian system there's no political vacuum to respond to your first point there. There's a clear line of succession which has been activated under the Iranian constitution. They're going to have new elections within a 50-day period. The office of the president isn't vacant, and there's a diffusion of responsibilities under the constitution of the Islamic Republic. So nobody in that system, and it's quite deliberately built this way, as are many countries' constitutions, to make sure that the disappearance of one man or the killing of one man doesn't derail the whole system. And I think that the Iranians have a pretty solid constitutional system at the moment. And I don't think, if anybody in the US was making a calculation that there would be a vacuum of power created, I think it was a clueless calculation on their part, because they clearly haven't studied the Iranian constitution, how it works. Because if you look at it, you can see that they clearly built this system up with this very situation in mind, given that they've been periodically under siege from 1980 onwards. Abtin says, did you know the piece of metal that keeps the rotor on a helicopter is referred to as the Jesus nut? A very scary piece of information. Information thus far favors accident, not malice. Yeah, as I said, helicopters are not the safest thing to travel in. Mushkin says, mildly enjoyed that as a plane nerd in Top Gun Maverick. Not saying who this evil target is, but they've got F-14s. Yes, the F-14, is it Tomcat? Am I remembering that correctly? It's been a long time since I looked at this. But yeah, the Iranians have kept like 1960s and 70s aircraft and flight worthy for a long time. Good evening to Lee, who's joined us. Yep, X says, although it's good news that Julian Assange isn't going to be extradited to the US after the latest hearing, he's still going to be rotting in prison. I feel they aren't going to let him go. Well, you may well be right about that. I mean, we'll come back to the Assange case tomorrow. I don't think that, I mean, I'll elaborate a little bit now on Yepex's comment. I don't think that the Biden administration wants him extradited this year. I think they want it spun out. I don't think they want the trial of Julian Assange in the United States would be, even if they tried to block it out, it'd end up being a media circus, even if the only people reporting on it were alternative media. And it would end up forcing its way into the US presidential election, which the Biden crew, the Democrats, really don't want. So my instinct is that they will keep spinning this out and leave him, as you say, in prison as long as they possibly can. Ideally, they'd hope that he'd just drop dead, but I think he's determined enough to see it through. They see this challenge through. So, yeah, the Biden crew won't want him in the United States, because if they take him to trial in the United States, even if they try and rig this in a million different ways to try and make sure that it's not covered in the bourgeois press, that it's all conducted as secretly as possible, the news will get out, and they'll have to do, even with the repressive laws they've got on the books there, they'll have to do things like reveal their evidence, and that will lead to damaging revelations. So they don't want a trial. I don't think. The US has got themselves into a position where they were hoping that he'd die or something, and that just hasn't happened. They now don't want the trial in the United States. They would prefer that he just be left to rot in prison in Britain forever. But we'll see how this develops. I mean, I need to dig into this some more to find out exactly what was said today. So I'll come back to it tomorrow. But my feeling is that the Biden crew do not want an extradition this year. Not until after the election anyway. They don't want Assange going on trial before polling day. Michael asks the question, where's Ahmadinejad these days? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether he could come back. Right, but Abtin answers the question. Ahmadinejad is politically active and a presidential candidate. Interesting. He was an interesting figure, Ahmadinejad. He was, I believe, a student radical, but I think he was one of the guys who was involved in the siege of the American embassy back in the day. His presidency was interesting as well. Certainly, it ended up unleashing his re-election. I think it was it 09, 08, 09, something like that. His re-election unleashed a lot of the contradictions in Iran that are still there. But certainly, his time in office was an interesting one. He was, of course, a close ally of Hugo Chavez as well. Any Spanish speakers in the chat? Certainly not me. My GCSE in Spanish was a long time ago. Jenny, good evening to you. Lertis, good evening to you from Cottonopolis, as was, just up the road from me. Sammy says, prefer that you refer to Ansar Allah rather than what the Western press likes to say is the Houthi rebels. Well, they're not rebels. They're the government of Yemen. They're the government of Yemen because they command they don't command all of the land mass that is Yemen, but they command the population centers, and they clearly are the choice of the Yemeni masses. I personally hope that they are able to attain victory and to extend their victory to all of historic Yemen. I think they will in the end. They certainly outfought the miserable armies of the Saudis and were steadfast in their defense of the country against the relentless bombing campaigns. And of course, they've now defeated US imperialism and British imperialism and French imperialism in the Red Sea. Operation Prosperity Guardian was a catastrophic failure. The Yemenis defeated them. So Ansar Allah, I mean, they are going to be the ones that define Yemen going into the next period. They're a very interesting movement, a lot of different tendencies in there. So to call them Houthi rebels is inaccurate in many different ways. Good evening to Tusker, who has joined us. Good to have you with us. Frank joins us from California/Iran. Good to have you here. Eric Schmidt says, does not always have to be an assassination attempt. In 2010, the plane carrying the Polish president, large parts of the government and leading military personnel crashed. They were on their way to meet Putin in Belarus. It was assumed by the reactionists that Russia did it. Yes, it's an interesting one. Simple mechanical failure, when it goes into the mixture of a already tense political situation, can prove explosive. Right. Clinton, greetings to you. Morgan, good to have you with us. Battle Cossack says, buenas noches from Argentina. HSD says, criticizing Iran in English as a Westerner functionally serves only one purpose. It helps manufacture consent for sanctions, wars, and other imperial interventions, which is why we stress the progressive role that Iran plays. Yes, F-14 Tomcat, says Guy. Ahmadinejad, says Abtin, is one of the better candidates, hated by many in the Iranian upper classes. Well, all the more reason to like him. He had a very strong Twitter game a while ago. I'm not sure if he's still on there. Again, he's one of those interesting characters, and it must be stressed that, of course, Iran, like everywhere else, has its different tendencies, has its class divisions. Its political system reflects that. It certainly seemed that Ahmadinejad was more popular in the rural areas of Iran and in some of the poorer areas of Iran. I must confess, I'm by no means as well read as I should be on his time in office, but I read that one of the things that he wanted to do was to improve the housing situation for the working class and the peasantry in Iran. Not sure how far he succeeded in that, but certainly the politics of Iran merit much more careful study than you're ever going to get in bourgeois academia. Right. Boyos says, it's inevitable if you invade or oppress a country, that country will reuse its culture or religion to resist, especially when religion's the only option left to you. Though the Francisco Gomez says, though there are a lot of opposition, like pan-Turkism in Iran, or militant, or the MEK. Well, the MEK is a purely US-run outfit, as far as I could tell. And it was once an indigenous Iranian-based organization, but I think it's long since just been reduced to a cult that's now run by CIA and MI6 money, principally CIA money, I think. Mr. Chopin says, apparently there is an artist that has $40 million worth of paintings and says that he will destroy them all if Julian Assange dies in prison. Well, that's very interesting. Won't change anything, though. Mary says that she speaks Spanish. Well, I used to be able to. Well, no, that's not true. I used to be able to say a few phrases in Spanish and conduct a basic conversation. Unfortunately, though, I've not used it for 15 years. So I'd need to undergo a crash course in conversational Spanish to see if it's still in the brain somewhere. Probably is. Potted Rodent says, wondering how often Biden takes a helicopter. Well, the American presidents do take helicopters, but then again, unless, of course, this has decayed along with everything else in the American system, but the American president's helicopter will be, as far as I know, kept rigorously up to date. Like even if the model that he flies around in is older, like you can bet that it undergoes up to the minute service, like almost every week at least. And also, the American reactionaries need to remember a thing or two about their own system. If Biden's helicopter crashed tomorrow, I mean, and he ended up and he carked it, or he just, they gave him too much speed and he finally popped his clogs. Well, would it matter? Would it completely destabilize the American system? Well, maybe now because you got, Wine and Xanax Harris might take over. But the American system is fundamentally governed by a bureaucracy. So even if you lost the president and the vice president, it probably destabilize things a little bit, hit the stock market. But there's a huge bureaucracy there that actually does the governing. And yes, and I imagine most Americans wouldn't care either. I think most Americans are probably far less fond of Biden than Iranians were of Raisi. Polish crash says Michael was pilot error. Right, where are we? Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about tonight was, of course, the ICC, International Criminal Court, which has issued a warrant for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister, along with 3 leaders of Hamas, including Ismail Haniyeh and Mohammed Deif. Now, I would say that this has, of course, drawn howls of protest from the usual gang of miserable psychopaths in Congress, and entirely predictably. The ICC, of course, had to do it to maintain any shred of credibility. If they hadn't have indicted Netanyahu, it would have meant that whatever credibility that organization had, that institution had left, would be gone. And they tried to balance it by indicting some Hamas leaders as well. But I couldn't help but feel that the protestations of the Biden administration were ringing a bit hollow. To be honest, I think that some of them in the Biden administration are quite happy to see old BB indicted, because, as a frequent guest on the show, Kit Clarenberg, said the other day, they want rid of Netanyahu. The Biden administration, and I think the American state itself, want they want him out. They've decided that if this is too much now, he's too despised, he's too corrupt, he's driven their Israeli colony into a ditch. His alliance with the fascists, which they wouldn't really mind if he wasn't making trouble, has caused too much trouble. It's threatening the whole position of American imperialism, as Hassan Nasrallah has correctly pointed out. It's threatening the whole position of American imperialism in the region. So they think that, well, if we can get Netanyahu out of there, if we can relegate Smotrich and Ben-Gvir back into whatever hole they crawled out of, then we can rebrand this and we can essentially pilot ourselves out of the dead end that we've got into. So now we see that there is a clear American imperialist plan for this, which is they remove Netanyahu, they get him out of the way, they remove Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they bring in either Yair Lapid or Gantz or some combination of the liberal. I shouldn't even do inverted commas. Liberals love a bit of colonial mass murder. The liberal opposition, and they rebrand the government. And because you saw the other day that both Gallant and Gantz were demanding essentially an Arab comprador regime be brought in to take over the running of Gaza. Now, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir want the maximalist option, which is that they want to impose a settlement program there. This would, of course, this was something that the American imperialists, it must be said, first of all, were prepared to support. Remember, Blinken's first mission over to West Asia was to try and get al-Sisi and the King of Jordan to support the mass transfer of population out of Gaza. This was something that even though that pair of wretched compradors had to say no to. So they had to come up with another plan. And as time has gone on and the situation has got worse, the American imperialists have come to the point where their new plan is to try and essentially push Hamas out of power in Gaza, impose some kind of comprador regime run by the PLA and supported by assorted Arab reactionaries, and call that a victory, essentially. They can then say, look, we disposed of the two problems. Remember the thing that the American imperialists around Biden, the officialdom, will say, and they will have in their press. So like Washington Post, New York Times, Thomas Friedman himself, the man with his ear to the ground in the American ruling class circles. Again, go back to what he said at the very beginning, because again, he's wired into ruling circles in both Washington and Tel Aviv. And what he says is usually reflective of how certain elements within the American state are talking. So when Friedman keeps saying over and over again, as he has been, the problem is Netanyahu and Hamas, the problem is Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Hamas, then that's clearly what's being said inside the circles of power. And so when, therefore, we get to the point where, well, who's being indicted? Yes, Gallant's been indicted as well, but I think the American imperialists have decided to shunt, or they would prefer to shunt Likud off to the side. But it's designed, this indictment, to increase the pressure on Netanyahu to quit, to get out, basically, and to be forced out. He knows that he's fucked if he does, but I suspect the American imperialists will offer him a way out at a certain point soon. Say, look, BB, time's up. You can go back to, is it Philadelphia he's from, in the United States? You can retire in Florida. You can go and hang out at the same strip club as your wretched son. But you can't hang around here anymore. It's over. And you'll have this, if you continue in power, you'll have this arrest warrant be hanging over your head for a long time, and you won't be able to go anywhere. If you leave now, it can all go away. The guy, the ICC prosecutor, Khan, this guy's a complete creature of US and British imperialism. So in my view, there's two reasons why they've done it. One is to try and restore the credibility of the ICC, which had taken a big hit because it was indicting Putin for nothing on nonsense charges, and it was refusing to do anything about Netanyahu. So they've saved their credibility a little bit by doing this. And the other reason is to put more pressure on Netanyahu to try and force him out. And so they can then they can get their government run by Gantz and run by Lapid into power, and they can try and impose this comprador regime on Gaza. None of this is going to work, by the way, not least because Netanyahu is not inclined to cooperate with them. He's not inclined to give the US what it wants on this because he's terrified of what would happen to him if he's no longer prime minister. There's also an ego thing involved as well. He doesn't want to be slung out of office having visibly lost this war. And there'll be a huge list of people who want to off him. So he'll never be secure ever again. So this, in my view, this all forms part of a very cynical plan from the imperialists to try and rebrand Israel, to try and calm things down, to try and essentially then get rid of the National Liberation Forces in Gaza, bring in the compradors and try and calm the whole thing down, and then essentially work on restoring their position in West Asia. So this is, I think, the overall picture here, which the indictment plays a role in. Doesn't mean that the ICC is to be taken seriously for a moment. It shouldn't be. None of the so-called international courts created by imperialism should be. These are mainly purveyors of victor's justice or imperialist propaganda, basically. But it's an interesting wrinkle, so to speak. And we will learn more about it as time as time goes on. Right. Where are we? Trying to catch up with the comments here. Apparently the helicopters used by the American presidency are Sea Kings. Right. Is that an Anglo-American aircraft, an Anglo-American helicopter? Because the British Air Force uses a lot of those. Yeah, it's Vietnam era, says Muskin. So yes, they need to stay on top of the maintenance. Cobra Commander says, "Why I love Fidel Castro." He said, "I don't wear a bulletproof vest." Yes, well, he won in the end on that particular score. All those assassination attempts that never got near him. Also, must be pointed out that Fidel's greatest strength was the support of the masses. If you have the support of the masses and you can mobilize the masses, then you are, if not immune to assassination attempts, then it becomes incredibly difficult, as it was with Fidel. Abtin says, many of the people in the leadership of Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, all of them are veterans of wars and revolutions. They aren't fearful people. No, they're not. And if you'd lived through the Iran-Iraq war, which was 8 years of unremitting brutality, including attacks by poison gas via the Iraqi leadership, poison gas supplied from, of course, the imperialist countries. If you'd lived through the horrors that were inflicted on Yemen, if you'd lived through the imperialist interventions into Lebanon, if you're a Hezbollah guy and you fought for decades to rid Lebanon of the Israeli occupiers, then you've seen, and if you lived through all of that, you've seen all the horrors and the tricks that imperialism has. So you know that they can be beaten. That's the thing. What all of that proved was, like Yemen, they threw everything at Ansar Allah for over a decade and they couldn't beat them. The Israelis tried every trick in the book to destroy Hezbollah and lost in the end. The US has tried numerous times to destabilize and destroy the government of Iran, and it hasn't worked. So these people all know that they can beat the imperialists, and that they know the imperialists are weakening now. So again, like, this will inspire you, to do things that the regular person wouldn't, because again, regular person doesn't have that experience. Jack misses the music at the beginning. Well, you know what? I am going to bring it back. I'll be sorting that out tomorrow. Abtin says Israel needs an Obama candidate, the last refuge of liberal scoundreldom. Well, I don't know who that would be in Israel, unless they're going to nominate an extremely racist Ethiopian. Maybe. Don't rule anything out. But I think that they can't rebrand this. I think that's the thing. They think that they can just do a rebrand because that's how these people always calculate. They think if they can just get the public relations right, people won't get so mad about a genocide. But it's not going to work. Things are too far gone. To answer S.W. Haster's point, no, they can't rebrand this. They think they can because they're arrogant and very stupid. But you can't. They think they can stick a new face on this, stick a comprador regime in charge of Gaza, pin the whole thing on Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and try and move on. But of course they can't, because October the 7th can't be undone. And nor can the genocide itself, but nor can the losses imposed upon the Israeli army. The fact that the Israeli army has been revealed to be very weak, poorly led, poorly trained, poorly motivated. It's a weak, ill-disciplined organization that can only survive because it has the ability via its air force and artillery to level whole city blocks and kill thousands. But in terms of an actual fighting force, it's been revealed to be useless. So you can't undo any of this. The US is just getting desperate and thinks that it can. And Jenny rightly mentions the Palestinian and the Donbass resistance. That's very true. Richard asked, what was the Yemeni civil war about? Well, it was, which one? First of all, there's been a few. But the most modern one started nearly 15 years ago now, and was principally a war of liberation to get rid of the pro-US stooge regime led by Ali Abdullah Saleh. And Ansar Allah came to prominence through that. And there's a decent account of it in the book by Jeremy Scahill. Covers quite a bit of what went on in Yemen like 15 years ago. I mean, Scahill's clearly got his limitations. He's associated with The Intercept, but there's some decent historical reporting in that. So his book on that is quite interesting. But yes, it was a long-term war, first against the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Then once Saleh had been killed, it was a war to liberate Yemen from the armies of foreign intervention headed by the Saudis. But the Saudis were, of course, just the proxy force for the Americans and the British. And it was a war really of national liberation waged by Ansar Allah as the chief component of the National Liberation Forces. That's a very shorthand way of putting it. Read the Scahill book. I think there's some books by an academic called Issa Bloomy as well. And there's the Al Danmaki account on Twitter who covers a lot of this as well. But that's my very shorthand sketch of it. Maro Mine says, are the protests in Israel coming from the left or the right? Both. I think the protesters who are demanding the release of the hostages and that Netanyahu make a deal, a lot of them will be the same people that were opposed to the judicial changes. A lot of the Zionists in Israel hate Netanyahu and have always hated him. And they hate the settler parties led by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and others. The problem is that the Israeli left, such as it is, has almost completely collapsed. So the reason why Netanyahu keeps coming back is that he proved to be the most skillful arsehole who could put together a coalition. the Israeli liberals, people like Lapid, Naftali Bennett, Benny Gantz, kept proving to be incapable of sticking a government together that would last more than a year. That's why Netanyahu keeps coming back. So the protests at the moment are coming from the people who were the liberal opponents of Netanyahu, the people who want to see some sort of deal done. There's many others, though, who don't want any deal. The only deal they want is more mass slaughter. So this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out, basically. YouTube deleted Jenny's comment about Ansar Allah. Well, you're not allowed, apparently, to type out that Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, and the Palestinian National Liberation Forces are destined to win. They are destined for victory. Apparently, YouTube doesn't like realities, but it is basically owned by Google, who are basically owned by the U.S. Department of Defense. So why should we be surprised? The narratives, asks Boyo, is that they have to remove Hamas. So if they don't do that, surely it's a loss. Yeah, it is, which is why the US wants to impose this comprador regime. They want to stick a new government in Gaza, maybe under, Mahmoud Abbas's gang or somebody else, paid for probably by the Saudi and UAE comprador regimes. Again, that's not going to work. They're not going to be able to uproot Hamas from either Gaza or the West Bank now. Hamas is coming out of this even with whatever losses they've sustained, immeasurably strengthened. So none of these plans of theirs are going to work. Right. Okay. So we are getting on towards the hour mark now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw it to a close for this evening. There are currently 363 of you watching, so thank you to all of those who have tuned in. That's 228 of you on Twitter or X and 132 on YouTube. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Be back tomorrow with more on the Assange case. So please do join me for that one. And the music will be returning tomorrow by popular demand. So until the same time tomorrow, this has been myself presenting this program, and I will return to you with more then. Thanks again for tuning in. Back with you very soon.